billionaire left a bag of cash on the bed to test his maid. The maid's response left him speechless. The door to the master bedroom closed softly, but inside the penthouse, the tension felt loud enough to echo. Hidden behind a thick, floor-length curtain near the panoramic window, the billionaire stood still, his tall frame rigid, his eyes fixed on the bed at the center of the room. Resting neatly on the white silk sheets was a black leather bag, carefully placed, deliberately staged. Its zipper was open just enough to reveal what was inside: bundles of crisp American $100 bills stacked tightly together. The money looked unreal, almost theatrical, as if it had been placed there to tempt fate itself. This was no mistake. This was a calculated test, one he had planned for days. Outside the glass walls, the city stretched endlessly, glowing with afternoon light. Inside, however, time felt suspended. The billionaire had spent his entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Advisors, executives, distant relatives, strangers with rehearsed smiles, everyone claimed loyalty, honesty, gratitude. Yet again and again, money had revealed how fragile those claims truly were. Today, he wanted a different answer. Not from a boardroom or a contract, but from someone the world barely noticed. Footsteps approached from the hallway. The maid entered quietly, as she always did. Her movements were careful and respectful, shaped by years of working in homes where silence was expected and invisibility was rewarded. Her uniform was clean and neatly pressed, her hair pulled back tightly, her face calm but tired in a way that came from long hours rather than age. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to take pride in doing honest work. Even when no one praised it, she walked toward the bed. Focused on her routine, straighten the sheets, smooth the pillows, check the knitstand. Then she saw it, the bag. Her steps slowed, then stopped completely. Her eyes fixed on the black leather as if it didn't belong in the room, as if it had appeared there by mistake. For a brief moment, she thought she might be imagining it. But it was real. The money was real. So close she could see the edges of the bills, the faint texture of paper, the unmistakable green color. The room felt different now. Heavier, quieter dot behind the curtain. The billionaire leaned forward slightly, his heart beating faster than he expected. He had arranged this perfectly. No cameras. No witnesses. No instructions. Just temptation and silence. He believed this was the purest way to measure character. When no one is watching, when the risk seems non-existent, what choice does a person make? The maid glanced toward the door. It was closed. She listened. Nothing. No voices. No footsteps. No sign that anyone else was nearby. For someone in her position, the opportunity was unthinkable and undeniable at the same time. That amount of money could change everything. It could erase debts she had carried quietly for years. It could pay for medicines, repairs, relief she had never allowed herself to imagine. The billionaire watched closely, expecting her to act quickly, to reach for the bag before doubt could interfere. But she didn't. Instead, she stood there, her hands slowly lowering to her sides. Her expression shifted not to excitement, but to something deeper and more complicated. She took a small step back from the bed, as if creating distance between herself and the temptation. The billionaire frowned slightly. This wasn't what usually happened. Most people hesitated briefly, then justified their decision. He had seen it countless times. This hesitation felt different. Minutes passed. The maid finally reached toward the bag, and behind the curtain, the billionaire's focus sharpened. This was it. The moment that would confirm his long-held belief that given the chance, people would always choose themselves. Her fingers hovered just above the leather handle. They trembled not with greed, but with the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She closed her eyes for a brief second. When she opened them again, she did something unexpected. She didn't lift the bag. Instead, she carefully zipped it closed, hiding the money from sight. Then she picked it up gently, as if it were fragile, and placed it on the nightstand, far from the edge of the bed. The billionaire's breath caught in his chest. This wasn't part of the pattern he knew so well. The maid smoothed the sheets where the bag had been, her movements slow and deliberate, almost ceremonial. She straightened the pillows, adjusted the blanket, and made the bed look untouched, as if the money had never been there at all. From his hiding place, the billionaire felt something shift inside, him confusion mixed with disbelief. But the test wasn't over. After finishing the bed, the maid stood still again, staring at the nightstand. Her lips pressed together as if she were thinking carefully. Then she did something that no one, especially the billionaire, had anticipated. She turned and walked out of the room. The billionaire waited. Seconds passed. Then minutes. He remained hidden, unsure whether to step out or continue observing. Just as he began to move, the door opened again. The maid returned, holding something in her hand. His eyes narrowed as she approached the nightstand and placed a folded piece of paper next to the bag. A note. She looked around the room one last time, unaware of the man watching her every move. Then she nodded to herself, as if settling a difficult internal argument, and quietly left the room, closing the door behind her. From behind the curtain, the billionaire finally stepped forward, his confidence shaken, his curiosity burning stronger than ever. He walked toward the bed, his eyes fixed on the bag and the note beside it. He reached for the paper, and as he unfolded it, he realized this test was about to take a turn he never expected. The billionaire stood alone in the center of the bedroom, the quiet now louder than before. The curtain behind him swayed slightly, exposing the place where he had hidden moments earlier, but his attention was locked on the folded note resting beside the bag. He picked it up slowly, as if sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile truth was unfolding. The paper was plain, slightly creased, the kind someone carried in a pocket for emergencies. When he unfolded it, he didn't see excuses, demands, or gratitude. What he saw made his chest tighten. The handwriting was neat but modest, each word written with care, as if the writer understood the weight of every sentence. The maid hadn't signed her name. She hadn't explained her struggles. Instead, the note was simple and direct. She had written that the bag did not belong there, that leaving money unattended invited trouble, and that she hoped whoever owned it would be more careful in the future. At the bottom, there was one final line that unsettled him the most. It said that some things were worth more than money, even when no one was watching. The billionaire read the note twice, then a third time. He had expected many outcomes from this test: greed, fear, excuses, but not this. Not restraint. Not quiet integrity without an audience. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar stir inside him. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't pride. It was uncertainty. He realized how confidently he had assumed the result before the test even began. He placed the note back on the nightstand and sat down at the edge of the bed. The bag of cash suddenly looked smaller, less powerful, almost insignificant. For decades, money had been his ultimate measure. Loyalty could be bought. Silence could be bought. Even forgiveness often came with a price. But this moment resisted being categorized so easily. The maid had walked away from a life-changing sum without drama, without witnesses, without expectation of reward. Later that afternoon, the billionaire reviewed the maid's file. He had never bothered to look closely before. To him, she had been part of the background, someone who ensured order and cleanliness without drawing attention. The file revealed very little steady employment, no complaints, no incidents. She had worked for years without missing a day unless absolutely necessary. There were notes about her requesting fewer hours during certain months, always unpaid, always approved quietly. He found himself wondering why. The next morning, he decided to continue the test. though it was already evolving into something else. This time, he wanted answers, not spoken ones, but observed truths. He instructed his staff to proceed as usual, said nothing about the bag or the note, and went about his day as if nothing unusual had happened. But his eyes followed the maid whenever she was nearby. He watched how she treated others, how she spoke to the security staff, how she handled fragile objects with care that suggested more than professionalism. He noticed how she stayed late without being asked when another employee fell behind. How she quietly fixed small problems instead of reporting them. How she declined tips politely, insisting it was part of her job. None of it felt performative. It felt consistent, almost instinctive. The billionaire began to understand that the note had not been a calculated act. It was simply who she was. That evening, he gave a subtle instruction. Another test, smaller but revealing. He had an envelope left on a hallway table near where the maid would pass, clearly labeled with his name, partially open, a few bills visible inside. Once again, no cameras. Once again, no witnesses. He positioned himself at a distance where he could see without being seen. The maid approached the table, noticed the envelope, and stopped. Her reaction was immediate and unmistakable. She didn't hesitate this time. She picked it up, closed it securely, and walked straight toward his private office. She knocked, waited, then handed it directly to his assistant, explaining calmly where she had found it. No note this time. No commentary. Just action. The billionaire turned away before she could see him watching. He felt something shift permanently. The test had stopped being about her long ago. It was about him now, about the assumptions he carried, the walls he had built, and the distance he had placed between himself and ordinary decency. That night, he made a decision, but before he could act on it, something unexpected happened, something that would force him to confront not just the maid's character, but his own past in a way he had never prepared for. The decision the billionaire made that night didn't bring him peace. Instead, it opened a door he had kept locked for years. As he sat alone in his study, city lights reflecting off the glass walls, the maid's quiet actions replayed in his mind again and again. The note, the untouched money. The envelope returned without hesitation. None of it fit the story he had told himself about people like her, or people like him. For the first time in a long while, his success felt hollow, built on assumptions that were now cracking under their own weight. The next morning, he requested a private report from Human Resources, something he had never done before. He wanted to know more, not just employment history, but context. What came back unsettled him. The maid had been requesting reduced hours not for rest, but to care for someone. Medical appointments. Long-term care facilities. Rising costs quietly paid in installments. She had never asked the company for help. Never requested advances. Never complained. She had simply adjusted her life around responsibility and carried on. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He recognized that pattern. He had lived it once, long before the skyscrapers and boardrooms. Responsibility without recognition. Pride without reward. He hadn't thought about that version of himself in decades. Somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that hardship either broke people or turned them dishonest. The maid was proving that belief wrong with every small choice she made. He decided to speak with her, but not as a benefactor, not as a judge. He wanted to understand. He arranged for a brief meeting under the pretense of routine staff acknowledgments. When the maid entered his office later that day, she looked nervous but composed, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She didn't know why she had been called in. From her perspective, she had done nothing out of the ordinary. The billionaire studied her closely, searching for signs of expectation or fear. He found neither. He thanked her for her work, mentioning her consistency and reliability. She nodded politely, listening more than speaking. When he asked about the note she had left in the bedroom, she looked genuinely surprised that he knew about it. She explained calmly that she believed honesty mattered most when it went unnoticed. She said it simply, without pride or hesitation, as if it were an obvious truth. Her words lingered in the air long after she left the room. Later that week, the billionaire changed his approach entirely. Instead of another test, he created an opportunity. He arranged for a small emergency fund to be quietly available for employees facing hardship, no questions asked. No publicity. No announcements. He wanted to see who would use it and how. Days passed. Then weeks. The maid never applied. Others did, carefully, gratefully. She continued working as she always had, arriving early, leaving late, never asking for more. The contrast struck him deeply. The person who had been most deserving of help was the one least willing to ask for it. One evening, as he walked through the staff corridor, he overheard a brief conversation. The maid was speaking softly to a younger employee who was clearly overwhelmed. She offered reassurance, practical advice, and even volunteered to cover an extra shift. No reward, no recognition. Just quiet support. The billionaire stood out of sight, listening, feeling something tighten in his chest. He realized the test he had designed had revealed far more than character. It had exposed a kind of strength he had long forgotten how to value. That night, he reviewed his will. He hadn't planned to. It wasn't urgent. But something compelled him to look at the legacy he was building. Numbers, assets, foundations bearing his name. None of it felt complete. He began to question whether wealth without wisdom was just another form of poverty. The maid's choices had forced him to confront that uncomfortable truth. By the end of the week, he made another decision, this one irreversible. He arranged a final meeting, one that would change both their lives in ways neither of them could yet imagine. But before he could reveal anything, circumstances intervened. A sudden crisis emerged within his company. One that threatened everything he had built and demanded. Immediate trust in the one person who had already proven she deserved it. And this time, the test would not involve money left on a bed. The crisis didn't announce itself with noise or panic. It arrived quietly, disguised as routine business, which made it far more dangerous. Early one morning, the billionaire was informed that a confidential transaction had been flagged by an internal audit. At first glance, it looked like a minor accounting irregularity. But as more details surfaced, it became clear that someone inside the company had been manipulating transfers over time. Carefully enough to avoid detection, but boldly enough to cause serious damage if exposed publicly. The billionaire felt the familiar pressure return, the kind that had shaped his instincts for decades. Lawyers were called. Executives were summoned. Meetings stretched for hours. Everyone spoke confidently, offering solutions, assigning blame, protecting themselves. Yet as the room filled with voices, the billionaire felt a growing sense of unease. He had seen this pattern before: too many people eager to control the narrative, too few concerned with the truth. He dismissed everyone and chose to walk the building alone, something he rarely did. As he passed through service corridors and quiet workspaces, he found himself drawn, almost unconsciously, to the parts of the building where things functioned without pretense. That was when he saw the maid again, carefully organizing supplies in a storage room, focused and unhurried despite the tension spreading through the company. Without planning to, he stopped and spoke to her. He didn't mention the audit. He didn't mention the money. Instead, he asked a simple question: how she handled situations when something felt wrong but wasn't obvious. The maid paused, thinking carefully before answering. She explained that small problems were often signs of bigger ones, and ignoring them made things worse. She said the best approach was to trace issues back to their source, patiently, even if it meant asking uncomfortable questions. Her response was practical, grounded, and strikingly clear. The billionaire thanked her and walked away, feeling a strange sense of certainty settle over him. Back in his office, he did something unexpected. Instead of relying solely on executives who had much to lose, he requested assistance from departments usually overlooked: maintenance logs, cleaning schedules, access records. Patterns emerged quickly. Times when certain areas were unusually busy. Documents moved after hours. Rooms cleaned that hadn't been scheduled. The maid's quiet attention to detail suddenly felt invaluable, not because of who she was, but because of how she observed the world. Within 48 hours, the source of the manipulation was uncovered. It wasn't a low-level employee, as some had suspected. It was a senior manager, someone who had spoken the loudest during meetings, someone who had earned the billionaire's trust years earlier. The betrayal stung, but it didn't surprise him anymore. What surprised him was how easily the truth had surfaced once he stopped overlooking the people who kept everything running smoothly. The fallout was swift and controlled. The company was protected. The scandal contained. Investors reassured. And yet, the billionaire felt no satisfaction. Instead, he felt a growing resolve. The maid's influence, though indirect, had reshaped how he saw his organization and himself. He realized that leadership built only on authority was fragile. Leadership grounded in integrity was something else entirely. A few days later, he called the maid into his office again. This time, the atmosphere was different. There were no hidden tests, no staged temptations. Just a conversation. He told her that her actions, small as they might have seemed, had made a difference. He didn't offer details. He didn't need to. She listened quietly, slightly uncomfortable with the attention, and thanked him for his words. Then he did something she didn't expect. He offered her a new role, not a promotion in the traditional sense, but a position built around trust and oversight, one that required discretion and judgment rather than credentials. The maid hesitated. She said she wasn't qualified. He replied that qualifications could be taught, but character could not. The offer stood, whether she accepted it or not. She asked for time to think. As she left the office, the billionaire leaned back in his chair, aware that this was no longer about rewarding good behavior. It was about redefining what value looked like in his world. He understood that the final outcome of this journey wouldn't be measured in money or titles, but in the kind of example he chose to set. What he didn't yet realize was that her decision, whatever it would be, was about to reveal one final truth. One that would force him to confront the deepest test of all, whether he was truly ready to change, or simply admired integrity from a safe distance. The maid did not give an answer right away. She returned to her duties as she always had, moving through hallways and rooms with the same quiet focus, but her thoughts were heavier than usual. The billionaire's offer echoed in her mind, not because of status or opportunity, but because it carried responsibility. She understood responsibility well. It was something she had lived with for years. Long before anyone had noticed her work or spoken her name with respect. That evening, after her shift ended, she sat alone in a small break room, staring at the floor as other staff filtered out one by one. She thought about the trust the billionaire had placed in her without demanding proof beyond her actions. She also thought about the risk. Accepting the role would change how others saw her. It would place her in unfamiliar territory, surrounded by people who might question why someone like her had been chosen. She had learned long ago that standing out often came with consequences. Meanwhile, the billionaire waited, though he told no one. He found himself unusually restless, checking his phone more often than necessary, replaying their conversation in his head. He realized that for all his power, this decision was not his to control. He had extended trust. Now he had to accept whatever came next. That realization unsettled him more than any financial risk ever had. The following morning, the maid requested a brief meeting. When she entered his office, her posture was straight, her expression calm but serious. She thanked him for the offer and spoke honestly. She said she had never imagined herself in such a role, but she also believed that turning away from responsibility simply because it was unfamiliar would be a mistake. She agreed to accept on one condition. She wanted the role to remain quiet. No announcement. No special treatment. She wanted to earn respect through work, not titles. The billionaire agreed immediately. Over the next few weeks, the changes were subtle but undeniable. Processes improved. Small inefficiencies disappeared. Issues were resolved before they grew into problems. The maid, now working closely with different departments, noticed patterns others overlooked, not because she had special training, but because she listened and paid attention. People began to trust her, often without realizing why. She didn't intimidate them. She didn't impress them with authority. She simply made things work better. The billionaire watched from a distance, resisting the urge to interfere. For the first time, he felt like a student rather than a commander. He saw how trust created accountability, how humility opened doors that force never could. He also noticed something else. His company felt different. Quieter, steadier, more grounded. The culture was shifting, slowly but unmistakably. Then came the moment that tested everything. An external investigation began into industry-wide practices, and several companies were caught manipulating systems similar to the one his own company had narrowly avoided. Regulators scrutinized records, interviewed staff, and demanded transparency. Fear spread quickly. Some executives suggested minimizing cooperation. Others advised legal maneuvering. The billionaire listened, then made a decision that shocked everyone. He chose full transparency, guided largely by the systems the maid had helped put in place. The process was uncomfortable. Mistakes were acknowledged. Weaknesses were exposed. But when the investigation concluded, his company emerged not just unharmed, but strengthened. Trust from partners and the public increased. Internally, morale rose. People felt seen. Late one evening, as the building emptied and lights dimmed, the billionaire stood by his office window, reflecting on how a simple test involving a bag of cash had unraveled years of assumptions. He understood now that wealth had blinded him, not to dishonesty, but to quiet integrity. He had been measuring people by the wrong standards for far too long. There was only one part of this journey left unresolved. He needed to decide how this story would end, not just for the maid, but for himself. The final decision did not arrive with applause, headlines, or public recognition. It arrived quietly, late at night, when the building was almost empty and the billionaire found himself walking alone through corridors he had owned for years but never truly seen. The lights hummed softly overhead, reflecting off marble floors polished by hands he had rarely acknowledged. Each step echoed, not with authority, but with memory. This was the same building where power had once defined every interaction, where success had been measured in control and outcomes. Tonight, it felt like a place of reckoning. He stopped near the service wing, the overlooked heart of the building. This was where schedules were kept, supplies managed, and problems solved before executives ever noticed them. This was also where the test with the bag of cash had quietly unfolded. Standing there, the billionaire allowed himself to think honestly about the man he had become and the man he used to be. He remembered arriving in America with nothing but ambition, working exhausting hours, sleeping in small rooms, promising himself that one day he would never feel powerless again. That promise had driven him forward, but it had also hardened him. Somewhere along the way, protection turned into suspicion. Trust turned into tests. He realized then that money had never corrupted him directly. What it had done was teach him to doubt people before giving them a chance. The next morning, the maid arrived before sunrise, just as she always did. Her routine was unchanged. She wore the same uniform, moved with the same quiet efficiency, and greeted others with the same gentle nod. She had not told anyone about her expanded responsibilities, nor did she intend to. In her mind, work was still work, and doing it well was its own reward. She had no idea that the billionaire had already decided how this chapter would close. When he called her into his office later that day, the atmosphere was different from every meeting before it. There were no assistants, no documents spread across the desk, no sense of evaluation. Just two people sitting across from each other in silence for a moment, longer than usual. He didn't begin by thanking her. He began by apologizing. He admitted that leaving the bag of cash had not been fair. He explained that it had been born out of his own mistrust, shaped by years of disappointment and betrayal at higher levels of power. He told her that he had expected her to fail the test, not because of who she was, but because of what money had taught him to believe about human nature. He acknowledged that her response, quiet and unremarkable to the outside world, had forced him to confront a truth he had avoided for years. Integrity often exists far from recognition, and character does not announce itself. The maid listened without interruption. She didn't defend herself. She didn't criticize him. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. She said she had done what felt right because she believed that choices mattered most when no one was there to see them. She added that money could solve problems, but it could not replace self-respect. Then she fell silent again. That moment stayed with the billionaire. He told her about the changes he was making, not as a reward, but as a responsibility he now understood. Leadership would no longer be confined to offices at the top. Systems would be built with transparency in mind, not fear. People who understood the company from the ground up would be included in decisions, not as symbols, but as safeguards. The maid's role would remain discreet, exactly as she wished. But the values she embodied would shape how the company operated long after this moment passed. In the months that followed, the results were impossible to ignore. The company grew more stable. Problems were identified earlier. Trust replaced tension. Employees felt accountable, not because they were monitored, but because they felt respected. The billionaire noticed that meetings grew shorter, decisions clearer, and excuses rarer. He found himself listening more than speaking, learning rather than directing. Years later, when people asked him what moment truly changed his life, they expected stories of high-stakes deals or bold risks. He never mentioned numbers. He spoke instead of a quiet room, a bag of money left untouched, and a handwritten note written with no expectation of reward. He spoke about how a single private choice revealed a truth no audit or strategy ever could. The maid continued to work with the same humility that had defined her from the beginning. She never sought recognition, never told her story, and never allowed her values to waver. Yet her influence remained woven into the culture of the company, reflected in the choices people made when no one was watching. And the billionaire, once obsessed with testing others, finally learned the hardest lesson of all. Trust is not something you prove with money. It is something you earn through character. And that lesson changed everything.